Hello everyone and happy December. I have so many books to tell you about because I read the most books in 1 month than I have in any other month in 2024. I read the most books that I have in 2024 in November. I read 13 books, some of them shorter than others, some of them quite long, so I'm just very excited to tell you about these and recommend them to you, tell you what I think, review them. I also accomplished my reading goal. I set myself 60 books was my goal. I wanted to read 60 books in 2024 and I reached it in November. So that's very exciting. I will tell you what my 60th book was as well. But the first book that I finished was Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I read this for my book club, the Well Read Book Club, and it was such a joy to read this with you guys. I filmed a whole separate reading vlog, so I will link that if you want to watch it. But this became a new favorite. We are following Sophie Hatter, who is the eldest of 3 sisters. She thinks she has really no great future. She doesn't have very good fortune, and it's about her being put under a spell, which makes her a very old woman, and how she has to go to the wizard Howl, who is known for taking the hearts and souls of young girls and stealing them. She has to go to him because she thinks that maybe that's the only place where she can get help getting her curse lifted. It also involves a witch called the Witch of the Waste, and my favorite character is Calcifer. He is a fire demon that runs Howl's moving castle, so Howl lives in a moving castle. And this story was just so magical, enchanting. I sped through it. It is so fast-paced, and I just loved everything about it. The pacing, the plotline, the writing, the characters, the character development, the story as a whole is just such an amazing book, and I loved it. I actually prolonged finishing it for about 2 days. I didn't want to read the last chapter because I just didn't want it to end. But I'm so glad that I read it, and I read it with you guys for my first book club pick because I started this new book club that I'm hosting on Fable, so if you want to join, the link is in the description. But it was just such a joy. Also, if you hear any construction noises, the construction workers across the street usually stop working around this time, but they're still going, and I wanted to film this video so that I could have it up for you guys, so I apologize if you hear any noises. But anyway, the next book I finished was also for a book club that I co-host, and that is the Game of Tomes book club that I co-host with Emma. I finished Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell in November, and I liked certain aspects of this book. I still don't really know exactly how I feel about it. Something was just missing for me. I loved the writing. The writing was so beautiful. I thought the story was really interesting. I loved the magic, especially in the beginning of the book, how we kind of like discover how the magic system, or how like just the magic in the universe of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell works. It's set in York and in London, and I loved reading about it while I'm in England, but I just found myself getting lost in the story. I wasn't really focused when I was reading. I didn't really care that much about the characters, which was such a shame. Like, major events would happen, and I wouldn't really have that much of a response or that much of a reaction to what was happening, so I don't know. I'm still trying to grapple with my feelings because I was really expecting to love the book, and I was just really shocked the more that I read, the less that I really cared, which is like so sad to me, and I hate that I'm saying that. But I thought the writing was gorgeous, and I really want to read more from from Susanna Clarke. So I do have another book of hers that I will be talking about later in the video. But anyway, that was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Still grappling with my feelings and still kind of sad that I didn't love it because I was really hoping and expecting to love it. The next book that I read was a very unique one, very out of my comfort zone. It was a surprising read for me, and one that I kind of picked up on a whim, and this is It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne de Marken. This is in the beautiful Fitzcarraldo editions, which are sold here in the UK, which they're just such a beautiful publishing company, beautiful editions. This is about a zombie main character. I have never read any book with like a zombie plotline. I don't really read a lot of post-apocalyptic type stories, and so this was very unique for me, but I really enjoyed it. It's about this main character who has forgotten her name and has forgotten like the names of her loved ones, and it's her in the afterlife grappling with losing herself, losing her body parts, and also trying to find this loved one that she's looking for, that she's forgotten their name. She addresses that loved one as you in the book, so it kind of feels like it's in that second person point of view where it almost feels like she's speaking to you, the reader, but she's speaking to you, her loved one. This book was unexpectedly really funny. There were certain lines that I was actually laughing out loud or like chuckling to myself. That always sticks in my mind when a book makes me laugh, and in this kind of story it was just a bit unexpected. Because I feel like post-apocalyptic books are, I don't know, my perception of them, it's just like I wouldn't classify them as funny. But there were some really funny moments, also really beautiful, heartbreaking moments. The writing at times was so poetic and beautiful, and I just really enjoyed it. It didn't become an all-time favorite, but I do recommend it if it sounds intriguing or interesting to you. It is quite gruesome at times, so if you can't handle some gruesome descriptions, I would maybe steer clear of this one. This is a book I would only really recommend to certain people who don't mind gore, are interested in zombie post-apocalyptic stories, or even if you kind of want to branch out. Like, I don't usually read those books, like I said, but it's very intriguing. It's very intriguing. Yeah, but I would read this. I would maybe like read the first chapter, see how you feel about it, and then go from there. So this is one that is an interesting recommendation for me. The next book that I read, I started reading before it won the Booker Prize, and then I finished it after it won the Booker Prize, and that is Orbital by Samantha Harvey. And this was fantastic. I'm so glad that it won the Booker Prize. It is so deserving of the recognition that it's such a great book. I spoke about this in a recent vlog, and I read some of the lines, some of the passages, and if you want to hear more about the book, I will link that video as well. But it was beautifully written. We are following these 6 astronauts as they orbit the Earth. I think 16 times. It's set over 24 hours, and they orbit the Earth 16 times. And it's a lot of meditations. This is a very thought-provoking, thoughtful book. There's not a lot of dialogue. It's just really meditative. Since most of us aren't astronauts, we don't really get the chance to see Earth from outer space, from that point of view that we get to see it while we read this story. And it really gives you a new perspective of what is home, how connected are you to that home and to your family and to the people on Earth and your relationship with the planet. And it's just such a beautiful story, and I really highly recommend it. Even if you aren't really a sci-fi reader, I don't really consider myself a sci-fi reader. I rarely read sci-fi. This is a bit more literary, like a literary fiction novel that's very thoughtful and meditative rather than like action-packed sci-fi. Like, there's really minimal action in this book. It's very quiet and thoughtful, and that's what I really, really loved about it. So highly recommend. So glad that it won the Booker Prize. Very deserving in my eyes. The next book Leon and I finished together, and that is Michael Bond's Love from Paddington, Letters from London to Peru, and this is illustrated by Peggy Fortnum and R.W. Alley. This is letters between Paddington and his Aunt Lucy, who lives in Peru, and he's basically writing about all his different adventures and the things that he gets up to while he's staying with the Browns in London, and it's so sweet and funny. There are so many chapters that Leon and I were like just laughing out loud with each other. This is my first Paddington book, and it was an absolute joy, and I can't wait to read more. The next book that I read was Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami, translated by Allison Martin Powell. It's a really beautiful representation of a developing relationship between two just like very honest portrayals of people. They felt so real, they felt so authentic, and there's a really beautiful quote on the back as well from The Independent, and it says, "Kawakami transforms an affecting cross-generational romance into an exquisite poem of time and mutability. Often enchanting but ultimately heartbreaking, this is an unforgettable evocation of love and loneliness." And my favorite aspect of this book was how ordinary it was. I spoke about this in my review on Fable and Goodreads, that this book felt very ordinary and slice of life and very realistic, and it wasn't written in any poetic or overly flowery way, but then the last line was so poetic, and because it was like the only really poetic line in the whole story, it just hit so hard. Whereas I feel like if the whole book was poetic and then the last line was also poetic, it would still be affecting, but it wouldn't be as affecting as a book that wasn't flowery and then had a slam bang finish.
Just happened to have a slam bang finish, sir.
Yes, sir.
Oh my gosh, it's just so beautiful. When I was reading this, it reminded me a lot of All the Lovers in the Night by Meiko Kawakami, which is a book I read last month. And All the Lovers in the Night is quite sad and quite heavy, but this was a bit lighter. There was quite a lot of humor in this book. This is another book that made me chuckle while I was reading quite a lot, and I definitely think it's one that I can recommend very easily. The next book I read I was so excited for, and that is DiCamillo's newest novel, The Hotel Balzaar. Such a beautiful book, beautifully illustrated by Julia Sarda, and everything about this book I absolutely loved. So we are following a young girl, Marta, right? Yes, Marta. And she and her mother are staying in this hotel. Her mother is a maid at this hotel, and we learn from the beginning that father is fighting in a war. They haven't heard from him in about a year, and Marta's mother tells her, like, be as quiet as a mouse, don't speak to anybody in the hotel. But Marta is a very curious young girl, and one day this older woman comes into the hotel and she is lavishly dressed. She has a parrot on her shoulder, and as you can see, the parrot is on the cover, and she's really captivated by this woman, and this woman comes over to her and says, oh, I love children, come visit me in my room, I have something to tell you. And although that is kind of creepy in reality, she goes and visits this woman, and this woman starts saying things that are reminiscent or things that her father, Marta's father, has said to her. And so she's very curious, like, maybe this woman knows something about my father. My mother and I haven't heard from him for a year. He's fighting in this war. They just want to be back together. They want to be a family again, and she wants to find out if her father is okay and wants to be reunited. Marta visits this woman, and the woman starts telling her these stories that really seem to have nothing to do with her father or her situation, but then there are little parts of the story that kind of do, and I loved it. I don't want to say too much because it is very short. I read it in about one sitting. I love DiCamillo. She is one of my favorite writers ever since I was a kid, and I just will read absolutely everything that she writes. Yeah, I just feel like she's such a kindred spirit. So I loved this and highly recommend it. I always say about middle grade stories and children's stories that we were all children once, and that children's stories aren't just for children, they're for everybody, and that's what I love about them so much. And to never forget that you were once a child. So I think you should read some children's stories if you haven't in a while, because they are wonderful. The next book I read, I loved, I adored. It was heartbreaking and beautiful and funny, and that is 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. And this is a real nonfiction story about Helene Hanff sending letters to a secondhand bookshop in London. So she is from New York, and she's writing these letters from New York City, and she has an antiquarian taste in literature. I will read you the first letter because, oh my god, I loved it so much. I just felt like she was such, again, a kindred spirit, and I related so much to what Helene Hanff was saying in this book. So her first letter to this secondhand bookshop, which is at 84 Charing Cross Road in London, she says, "Gentlemen, your ad in the Saturday Review of Literature says that you specialize in out-of-print books. The phrase antiquarian booksellers scares me somewhat, as I equate antique with expensive. I am a poor writer with an antiquarian taste in books, and all the things I want are impossible to get over here, except in very expensive rare editions or in Barnes & Noble's grimy, marked-up schoolboy copies. I enclose a list of my most pressing problems, If you have any clean secondhand copies of any of the books on the list for no more than $5 each, will you consider this a purchase order and send them to me? Very truly yours, Helene, Hanff. And that is from October 5th, 1949. Then the bookshop replies back, and she's mainly in correspondence with this one bookseller named Frank, and they start having a really beautiful correspondence, and then she starts writing with the other booksellers and their family members. And because this is post-war in England, they had a lot of food rations, and they, I think, were only allowed like one egg a month or something, or nylons were very expensive, so she ends up sending them nylons and eggs and a ham for Christmas. And it's just so beautiful because you can see history unfold. It's just such a beautiful correspondence, the fact that these are real letters. And Helene Hanff, her humor was impeccable. Like, she is the funniest, sassiest person, and I loved it. I kept writing. I was annotating this book as I was reading it, and I just kept writing in the margins, ha ha ha, ha ha ha. Every time she made me laugh out loud, I just had to write it out because I thought that she was just so funny. And she talks a lot about being a reader and loving books and how much she loves the UK editions. And if you guys know me, you know that I always prefer UK editions over the US editions for the most part. There are some really beautiful US editions. And the fact that she is writing from New York City. I went to college in New York City. I have grown up and live on Long Island with my family, and I'm here in England right now staying with Leon while he does his master's. And so I've been in England. I am a New Yorker. Like, everything about this book was just so relatable and perfect and beautiful, and I just adored it. I could go on and on and on, but yes, I highly recommend picking it up. If you love books about books, if you love bookish stories, this is so perfect. And the fact that it's nonfiction, like, these are real letters that we have the honor and privilege to read. Also, I just have to warn you about the last few letters. Heartbreaking, but yeah, so beautiful, so incredibly beautiful. I loved this very, very much. The next book I finished with Leon, and that is The Complete Bambly Hedge by Jill Barklem. We finished reading all of the stories in this beautiful collection. This drilling is really getting to me. It's just distracting. Anyway, I'm going to push through. So in this complete collection, we have Spring, Summer, Autumn, Winter story. And then we also have The Secret Staircase, The High Hills, Sea Story, and Poppy's Babies. And our favorites were Winter Story, The Secret Staircase, and The High Hills. They are so beautiful, gorgeously illustrated. Like, these stories, if you love Beatrix Potter, you will adore this. If you haven't read it, I cannot recommend it enough. They are just beautifully written, gorgeously illustrated, like unbelievable illustrations. And I think this is one of the most inspiring books I have ever read as an illustrator who loves this type of illustration. So it was just perfect, and we really, really loved reading this one. So highly recommend if you haven't picked it up. It is so beautiful. The next one I read because I wanted to read a Christmas story, and that is The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. I saw this beautiful little cloth-bound edition in Waterstones recently, and I really wanted to pick it up, but I wasn't sure how I would feel about it because I had not read O. Henry before, and I didn't want to pick up a book in case I didn't love it. I want to be particular about the books that I'm buying. So I ended up borrowing it on Libby, which is a audiobook and ebook app through libraries. And I borrowed it through Libby, and I read The Gift of the Magi, which is like a 10-page short story, and I loved it. Oh my gosh, The Gift of the Magi is an incredible short story, and you can probably find it as like a PDF version on the internet, but if you can also borrow it from your library, I would love for you to read it in any capacity. It is just such a wonderful, really quick story, and the second that I finished reading it, I was like, no, I have to get that cloth-bound edition. So I picked it up, and it's such a First of all, I mean, how beautiful are these? I love these editions so much. In here we have not only The Gift of the Magi, but also a few of his other short stories as well, so I'm really excited to read more of them. I will show you close up so you can see. So those are some other ones. Obviously the title, short stories, The Gift of the Magi. I'm so happy about this and can't wait to read more of these stories, especially now that it's December and the holiday season. I have a feeling that these are going to be, I mean, I don't know if they'll all be like holiday Christmas-esque, Christmassy, but I will find out and let you know. The next one I read, I was actually going to wait until December, like mid-December to read it, but I was really in the mood to pick it up, so I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna pick it up because I really want to read it and I don't want to wait. So that is The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clarke. So I was talking about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell earlier, and I really wanted to read more from her because I loved her writing so much, and I saw this at Waterstones recently and I was so excited by it because it is a really short novella that takes place in midwinter, or it's I think a few days before Christmas too, actually. Yeah, so the first line is, "It was winter, just a few days before Christmas. A few flakes of snow fell on the quiet fields. Along the lane that led to the wood came a carriage, driven by a young woman." And as you can see, this book is beautifully illustrated as well. It is illustrated by Victoria Sodden, and I really enjoyed this. It was so great. It has very much like a fable, fairy tale type feel, very snowy, and this main character, I don't want to say too much because it's so short. What do I want to say about it? I don't want to say very much. I'm just going to read you the quote on the back. It says, "A church is a sort of wood. A wood is a sort of church. They're the same thing, really." It's about this main character who is quite an unusual girl. She can talk to animals and trees. She is only ever happy when she is walking in the woods. And it's very much like a wintry fable, kind of eerie and spooky almost, but really magical and enchanting as well, and I really loved it. And I feel like after reading such a long epic story like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I was really interested to see how Susanna Clarke would handle a short novel, a short story. And I think that this is exactly what I wanted. The pacing was fantastic, the writing was fantastic. It didn't feel too short, it definitely didn't feel too long. I just really loved it, and I highly recommend picking it up. Also, this edition is so beautiful, oh my gosh. The last two stories that I read were very random choices. I read them on my Kindle, and I borrowed them also from Libby. And the first one I have been eyeing for so long, and I decided to pick it up on a whim, and that is The Skull by Jon Klassen. And Jon Klassen is an illustrator that I have been following on Instagram, and I've been following his work for years, but I hadn't read any of his books. After wanting to, I kept wanting to read his books, and I just never actually took the time to read them. And so on a whim, oh, I forgot to say, Bambly Hedge was my 60th book of the year, by the way. I forgot to say that. I just finished my reading challenge, and I wanted to read more short stories. I wanted to read more short books, and The Skull is a children's, it is a picture book, but it's a bit longer, and it's almost, I don't know, it's very eerie and kind of spooky, as you can tell probably from the title and the cover, but I don't want to say too much about it because it's so short. It reminded me a lot of the feeling that I got when I was reading The Wood at Midwinter. It had a very classic spooky fable type feeling. Jon Klassen wrote a little explanation of where the inspiration of the story came from at the end of the book, and I loved reading about that. And Jon Klassen's illustrations are just stunning, and I loved the story. I thought that it was so perfect for this time of year in between autumn and winter, because we have this kind of eerie, skull-related, spooky story mixed with it's also very, very snowy. I just loved that combination of the spookiness in the snow. I thought it was just perfect for this time of year. So I loved The Skull. The ending was quite dark. It is a very dark children's story, and I think that's what I love about it, because I think children like spooky stories, and I'm so glad that we aren't like shying away from those kinds of topics, especially because a lot of children's books, especially classics, can be very, very eerie, very spooky, that you don't really realize as a child, and then you grow up and you reread. Like, I know I remember rereading some stories I read as a kid, and I was like, that is so dark. Like Hansel and Gretel, just like this witch that lives in like a gingerbread candy house wants to eat these children, and I was just so not fazed by that when I was a kid. So anyway, I really loved The Skull. And then I read I Want My Hat Back by Jon Klassen, because this is one of his most iconic best-selling picture books. It's so short, it is so funny, and the ending, there's quite a twist at the end that I loved. Leanne and I read it together, and we were both cracking up throughout it, and then the ending was just so great. It's about this bear who has lost his hat, and he wants it back, and who took his hat, and what happens to the person who took his hat. It's just so great, or animal, I should say. I loved it. I love his illustrations. I'm so glad that I finally have read 2 Jon Klassen books, and I can't wait to read many more. So yes, I feel like I've been rambling for a very long time. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about all of these books. So, oh gosh. And they fell. Alright, so these are all the books, or most of the books, that I read in November. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about them. A lot of very different books from a lot of different age ranges and genres, so I hope you found something here that piqued your interest, that maybe you want to add to your TBR. And I would love to know what books you've been reading recently, what books you're planning on reading in December, because I love getting your recommendations, and I love adding more books to my list that you guys are enjoying. So let me know if you have read any of these, what you think about them, what you're reading. I would just love to hear what's going on in your bookish lives. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I apologize for the rambling, the light changing, the loud construction noises, but I really just wanted to get this video up and out to you guys. So thank you so much for being here, and I will see you very soon in another video. As always, happy reading.